On the morning of Thursday, August 28, 2025, Amtrak train 2154 pulled out of DC's Union Station at 6:50 a.m. headed north, like it does every weekday. And like it does almost every other day, it quickly got delayed. By just its first stop, the train was 13 minutes behind schedule. In some cars, the automated doors weren't automating, so employees had to manually articulate it at each stop. The delays began to compound. 35 minutes late leaving here, 44 here, and by the time it arrived in Boston, the train was nearly an hour behind. Now, for service that's not on time about a quarter of the time, such delays weren't particularly notable on their own. But while the route wasn't new, the train set was, and it came with big promises. This glitching northbound service was the maiden commercial voyage of the next-gen Acela, a much-anticipated brand-new train set boasting increased capacity, increased comfort, and increased top speeds over the aging Acelas they were poised to replace. A decade in the making, the rollout of these new trains was anything but subtle, as the so-called Acelebration was marked by music, fireworks, speeches articulating that for Amtrak, for the future of passenger rail in the US, this was a moment in history. The moment, however, felt slightly less revolutionary on the ground. Beyond these slightly embarrassing malfunctions on Route 2154, riders were left unimpressed by the stiff chairs, they were amused by the outdated USB-A offerings that hinted at how long delayed the project had been, and they were quick to note that the train wasn't reaching the much-anticipated top speeds of 160 miles or 260 kilometers per hour for long, sustained periods. The lukewarm reception continued from first-person reviews published everywhere from YouTube and Reddit to the New York Times. There were only 5 of these new Acelas active out of the 28 promised. There were no new routes or rail lines, and thus no time gains. The trains were roomier, the new tilting technology was more comfortable, the food and Wi-Fi was better, the trains were fine, but they didn't feel revolutionary. But for Amtrak users, for Americans hoping for better intercity rail, that's actually okay. In fact, this slow, imperfect rollout that's far short of a revolution, but also far from being a disaster, is the latest example in a series of successes, many of them the small, quiet, or imperfect variety, that has Amtrak boasting some of its best numbers ever and trending in the right direction, even in the face of what many feared as an existential threat to the service in the form of the second Trump administration. To establish what counts as a series of subtle wins for America's largest passenger rail purveyor, it's important to establish Amtrak's real mandates. To the general public, it's most likely that Amtrak is understood as a vaguely government-run service that is supposed to turn a profit but never actually does. That's close to right, and it's close to what you'll get from the top few lines of the Wikipedia article. That it's a quasi-public corporation that's managed as a for-profit organization, but this lacks some important nuance. Take the idea of for-profit, for example. In its founding legislation, the 1970 Rail Passenger Service Act, there was very limited flexibility in the language, as it stated that the National Passenger Rail Corporation shall be a for-profit corporation. Ever since, the idea has been closely associated with the service. At the time, this was a bold stance, but perhaps one that felt viable given the fact that the service would be inheriting all its rolling stock from the floundering private passenger rail sector, and it'd be borrowing rail access from the freight companies, a decision that still haunts the corporation's meager on-time percentage. In service by 1971, Amtrak by the end of 1972 was reporting a revenue of $160 million and an operating expense of $310 million. It was costing nearly double the year's revenue to keep passenger rail alive. Now, early Amtrak and its sponsor, Congress, understood that it would take some capital investment up front to get rolling, but quickly it also began to recognize that running Amtrak for profit was probably beyond the pale. In 1978, a small edit within the Rail Passenger Service Act acknowledged as much. With the addition of 4 words, that the corporation shall be operated and managed as a for-profit corporation, Amtrak's mandate from Congress quietly became more flexible. It was a subtle concession that saving a deeply unprofitable and thus cratering private passenger rail system in the US was not exactly going to be a moneymaker for the US government. Now turning a profit was not a necessity or an expectation, but operating in a similarly ruthless, bottom-line-oriented manner of a for-profit was. This difference matters, but this difference is also easy to overlook. A common talking point on Amtrak is that in its 50-plus years of existence, the service is yet to turn a profit. What gets left out here is that since 1978, it hasn't explicitly been mandated to. The myth that Amtrak exists to turn an eventual profit is not only an oversimplification, but also an obfuscation of the service's guiding purpose outlined in 1970. As the top of the act outlines, the National Passenger Rail Corporation's purpose was to procure something that the private sector no longer could: an efficient, modern, interconnected passenger rail system for the good of the country. For 50+ years then, Amtrak has not failed a mandate to turn a profit, but more accurately has failed to procure a quality intercity passenger rail system, largely on account of the myth that it's supposed to turn a profit. And yet, misunderstood, mocked and maligned, politicized and subsequently villainized, perpetually hamstrung by ebbing and flowing support, Amtrak, within its narrow confines, is fulfilling its mandates better than ever. To far less media fanfare than the Acela launch, Amtrak released this report at the end of 2024, and the top-line highlight was that the passenger rail service had set itself a new annual ridership record. Unsurprisingly, when broken down by the three major characterization of routes, the Northeast Corridor, the state-supported routes, and the long-distance routes, the first two categories, with similar ridership numbers and similar percent change increases from the year prior, are nearly entirely responsible for reaching the all-time mark in 2024. Outpacing pre-pandemic numbers too, it's not just a return to normalcy after COVID that explains this high watermark, but some deft maneuvering by the passenger service and its partners. These are Amtrak's state-supported routes. They are regional routes often connecting big and less big cities on the coasts and in the Midwest, and they account for about 40% of the company's total ridership. State-supported is a bit of a misnomer. They could just as easily be called Amtrak-supported, as it's the individual states that pitch these routes, but then it's Amtrak that plans and operates them. But that's all Congress will allow Amtrak to do, as 2008 passenger rail legislation established that only minimal federal aid would be available for routes fewer than 750 miles or 1,200 kilometers, more or less any non-overnight routes. In some ways, the existence of these state-funded routings highlights the limitations of Amtrak. It can't actually lead or fund the establishment of regional routes, no matter how promising. This helps explain the lack of coverage and seemingly random assortment of Amtrak routings across the US. But while perhaps a flawed concept in the bigger picture of a streamlined national rail system, Amtrak and its state partners are creatively expanding and optimizing these routes to great success. Look no further than the Borealis line. In 2024, Amtrak, partnered with the states of Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, launched this new service. It connects Chicago to St. Paul through Milwaukee. Averaging nearly 55 miles or 88 kilometers per hour and taking 7.5 hours to run its full course, it is not fast. Running both directions just once daily, departing near midday, it is not frequent. And traveling along a corridor that is already serviced by two other Amtrak routes, one a long-distance route, the other a higher-frequency state-supported route, it's not a terribly novel routing either. And yet, this route has been a revelation. In its first full year of operation, nearly doubling expected ridership. With passenger counts steady on both the long-distance Empire Builder and the higher-frequency Hiawatha that connects Chicago and Milwaukee, it doesn't seem that this success is attributable to cannibalizing ridership from other corridor connectors either, but rather a function of increased optionality and induced demand. For the St. Paul resident headed east, there's now an offering that takes off in the middle of the day and is far less likely to be delayed than the alternative Empire Builder headed in all the way from the Pacific Northwest. For the Chicagoan, there's another easy option to get to Milwaukee. And for the Wisconsin resident, while the train doesn't pass through the state's second and third largest cities, Borealis stops are within a quick drive for more than half the state's population, which then connects to two of the Midwest's most important cities. Without new stops or untested routings, and requiring just two train sets, the Amtrak and multi-state partnership boosted regional ridership and seemed to offer proof that the more options offered, the more people will choose to take the train. A similar boost on account of increased frequency came about in the Pacific Northwest. Across all state-supported routes, the Cascades route, connecting the region's three major cities, saw one of the largest year-over-year ridership growths in 2024, which happened to coincide with Washington and Oregon's respective Department of Transportations announcing another daily connection between Seattle and Portland in late 2023. Already an established and popular routing, increasing frequency only made it more convenient for the average Pacific Northwest traveler to opt for the regularly available 3.5-hour train ride instead of the 3-hour drive. Another ridership boost that didn't cost Amtrak much beyond rolling stock and labor. These state-led ridership boosts aren't just the result of smart route and service modifications, but outgrowths of decade-long network developments. Virginia, for example, has relied on Amtrak to operate its passenger routes since 2009, with the state leading an extension from Washington, D.C. to Lynchburg, then the following year establishing a service from D.C. to Richmond. With ridership immediately outperforming expectations, these routes marked only the beginning of the state's investment into its passenger rail system. In 2012, Virginia extended the Richmond service to Norfolk. A year later, it announced plans to extend the Lynchburg line to Roanoke. Then the state went further. It put $3.7 billion towards acquiring 223 miles of track outright, another 386 miles of right-of-way from freight rail owners, and to build a bridge across the Potomac that broke ground in 2025. Altogether, this project, built upon the foundation of the success of 2 route extensions in 2009 and 10, may well come to double total passengers. But for now, as of 2025, with 8 total daily round trips running across these routes, Virginia's already become a poster child for state-supported rail expansion. Now, Amtrak's agency over the expansion and investment in these routes is limited. They can't start them, they can't fund them, but they do operate and support them in any way they can. Where they do have more agency is within the Northeast Corridor, where Congress has been happy to take sole responsibility of funding because these, unlike the rest, turn a profit. And here too, Amtrak maneuvered fairly quietly but smartly in 2023 and 2024 to stimulate ridership growth. Adding 4 more weekday services between New York and DC, a new morning service from Philadelphia to New York, and a weekend trip between Philadelphia and Boston, Amtrak announced an extra 1 million seats for the Northeast Regional in early 2024. Even in a year where overall on-time performance proved pretty pedestrian by Amtrak standards, increased options and available seats helped push Northeast Corridor ridership over 14 million. Within tight constraints, Amtrak is doing some smart business. Without the investment afforded to other national rail systems, Amtrak is nowhere near competing as a world-class national rail carrier, but as a scrappy rail company, they're making it work. The deft maneuvering has gone beyond just reconfiguring and adding routings, too. There's also the infrastructure of it all. Take Amtrak's 5-year plan published in 2021. The vision, before understanding exactly when the world would start to get back to normal again, before the Biden-led infrastructure bill, before the second Trump presidency, looked like this. It consisted of considerations over new rolling stock, increasingly successful networks, and important replacement of aging infrastructure. Nearing the end of those 5 years, this fairly lofty, fairly vague plan is actually looking surprisingly fulfilled. With the new Acellas and the cleaner-burning ALC-42 locomotives coming online, Amtrak can check these boxes. With Virginia's heavy investment in its passenger rail system, the Long Bridge officially under construction, and with the establishment of a more streamlined process to establish state-supported systems, Amtrak can begin checking these boxes, too. But perhaps of most significance to the future of Amtrak service, there's been real progress on these 2 objectives: to move the Gateway program forward and get going on the Baltimore and Potomac tunnel replacement. In the past, it's been projects exactly like these that have held up Amtrak from providing better service. Projects that require heavy capital funding up front, projects that aren't deemed absolutely necessary because the infrastructure in place technically already works. But that changed in 2023 with the announcement of the Frederick Douglass Tunnel, a massive, decade-plus long project set to replace the BNP Tunnel. For all rail passengers along the southern portion of the Northeast Corridor, the BNP Tunnel connecting Baltimore Penn Station and BWI has been a speed bump. First, the approach curve from the southwest is prohibitively tight, requiring a slowdown before even entering. Then on the northeast end, the entrance curve hits a comparatively sharp 8 degrees, requiring passenger trains to slow all the way down to 30 miles or 50 kilometers per hour. This slowdown creates bottlenecks as 150 trains pass over these 2 sets of tracks each day. And across the 1.4 miles or 2.3 kilometers, the tunnel has a vertical grade of 1.34 degrees, which is the steepest along the Northeast Corridor and ensures the train stays slow throughout it. Not only is it an operational disaster, infrastructure experts have called it a literal disaster waiting to happen. It's exceptionally cramped, it's a single point of failure for the multiple passenger systems moving through it, it's nearly a century and a half old, and currently it requires millions in maintenance every year to ensure the water seeping into the ancient structure doesn't rot it out. It's tunnels like this that all but ensure passenger rail inefficiencies across the Northeast. And it's projects like this, the $6 billion Frederick Douglass Tunnel set to run a 2-mile path along a more gentle routing in the 2030s, that has Amtrak bullish on the future of a rail system with fewer glaring points of failure. Similar progress has been made through another pain point through the Northeast Corridor. Through a series of projects collectively called the Gateway Program, the Northeast Corridor is getting a facelift across its path into and through New York City. While the goal was to have a plan for the Hudson Tunnel figured out by 2026, things are actually moving faster, as ground has been broken and Amtrak hopes the project can be completed within a decade. That these projects are going forward at all feels surprising given the Trump administration's general stance towards passenger rail in the past. An interesting sign has begun to appear on government-led construction sites recently. In MAGA red, signs like this one at the Seattle Rail Yard have come to be associated with recent rail-related infrastructure. The same occurred with the rollout of the Acellas, a lot of red and a note that they were delivered by the Trump administration. Technically, for both, that much is true. These projects are being completed during Trump's second term. But these signs and statements are leaving out some context, that they were made possible by fairly far-sighted leadership and funding from years and decades prior. For the Seattle project and a host of others, this began with the Biden administration's bipartisan infrastructure bill, the same transformative bill that's the funding base for both the Frederick Douglass and Hudson tunnels too. It may be political opportunism for the Trump administration to claim these as their own successes, but it also is helping Amtrak advance its own goals. Amtrak's quiet wins and subtle successes also keep the service out of sight and out of mind, which may prove its way forward when dealing with hostile administrations. While the development of high-speed rail corridors, like the projected line connecting Houston and Dallas, are the hope for every American transit enthusiast, to a historically anti-rail administration, they serve as lightning rods, opportunities to pull funding and prove a point. The more humble projects, the quieter route additions, along with the longer-term projects already underway, however, are seeming to fall under the radar and thus are being left alone. And this may well prove the winning strategy: radical incrementalism. It's not fast, it's not terribly ambitious or satisfying, but for a service as infrastructure heavy and capital thirsty as passenger rail, getting better 1% at a time may well be the best way to ride the roller coaster of public opinion, wavering congressional support, and presidential backing that seems to do a full 180 about every 4 years. It's difficult to project another 5-year window as tumultuous as the past 5-year window for Amtrak. One that saw the moment of record ridership in 2019 immediately undercut by a global pandemic, then record federal investment in passenger rail immediately undercut by an assumed anti-Amtrak presidential nomination, and through it all, Amtrak came out the other side with a new record ridership figure, an important set of infrastructure upgrades, and an exciting new set of trains set to take slightly more riders to slightly more locations with slightly fewer delays. Now, it's impossible to know exactly what the future of transportation looks like in the United States, or the world for that matter, but if you'd like to have a slightly better understanding, I'd like to recommend the sponsor of this video, IEEE Spectrum magazine. Whether it's on the topic of transportation or energy or really anything tech-related, it's really hard to find sources that aren't overly speculative or dramatic or just plain irresponsible in their clickbaity conclusions when it comes to covering cutting-edge engineering. That's what makes IEEE Spectrum magazine refreshing. Its articles are written by experts in their field for an audience of engineers and innovators. If you're not familiar with the publication, I recommend going and checking out their website where you'll find a host of free and available articles. I'm confident the broad array of science, tech, and engineering stories written by experts but with a jargon-free and accessible tone will get you hooked enough to give the actual print magazine a try. Give the subscription a try and you'll be joining 300,000 engineers reading exclusive reviewed articles on a monthly basis. These magazines keep you in touch with cutting-edge trends, they look beautiful on a coffee table, and they make a thoughtful and fun gift for your fellow academically inclined family and friends. If you're watching this channel, you should probably be reading this magazine, so go ahead and give IEEE Spectrum magazine a look.